Hi, everybody, and thanks for watching this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to take a look at Mark chapter 1. It's a story of when Jesus enters into the synagogue in Capernaum and teaches, and then confronts a man with an unclean spirit. And we're going to look at the dialogue that happens between Jesus and this man with an unclean spirit. Now, we're going to focus especially upon how Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit. We're going to take a look at the Greek word behind rebuke and then the Hebrew word behind that and this whole Old Testament theology that informs us of what it means for Jesus to rebuke the unclean spirit and what that tells us about who Jesus is claiming to be. So some really fascinating Old Testament stuff coming up in Mark chapter 1. So let's start out by talking a little bit about what the city of Capernaum is, the name, what the name means, as well as a little bit about the history of synagogues and how they came to be and what purpose they served. So here you have a map of the Sea of Galilee, and you can see where Capernaum is located on the north or northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee. A bit farther down, you can see the city of Tiberias. This other map gives you a little bit broader perspective of where Capernaum is located in reference to some of the other cities we read about in the New Testament, like Bethsaida or Tiberias. If you follow the purple line, you can see it goes all the way down to Jesus' hometown of Nazareth, and then Cana is north of there. So Capernaum is from the Greek Capharnaum, but that itself is a transliteration of the Hebrew. So Capernaum is actually a Hebrew name. It comes from two Hebrew words, Kaphar, which is village of, and then Nahum, which means comfort or consolation. So Capernaum is the city of comfort, the city of consolation. So that's a little bit about the city and its location. Now, let's get into the text itself and look at the first couple of verses. They, that is Jesus and his newly called disciples, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So, as we know from other New Testament stories, evidently there were synagogue officials, and sometimes a traveling rabbi or traveling teacher would be invited on the Sabbath to give a talk about whatever, to talk about the scriptures, talk about the Torah, talk about the prophets. So evidently Jesus was already known in this particular area, and he was invited on the basis of what was known about him to speak that particular Sabbath, to give a lesson on whatever the scriptures to be read that day might be. And he amazed them. He spoke as one who had authority, not just like the Bible teachers of the day, not like the scribes, not like those who were engaged in scriptural study and copying. No, he spoke as one who had authority. Now, let's suppose that you don't really know a whole lot about the Bible, but you decided you're going to read through the scriptures. And so you start with Genesis and you work your way all the way through the Old Testament. And you've read about tabernacles, you've read about temples, and then you get to the end of the Old Testament and you jump into the New Testament. And all of a sudden you're confronted with this new thing called a synagogue. And you might ask yourself, well, what's a synagogue? There's no mention whatsoever of the synagogues in the Old Testament. Well, synagogues came to be in what's usually called the intertestamental period. It's that few centuries between the end of the last Old Testament book and the beginning of the Gospels. So synagogues probably came to be because the Jews were spread out. The diaspora, the spreading out of the Jews all over the Greco-Roman world had happened. There were a number of Jews. In fact, the majority of Jews stayed in Babylon after they were allowed to return to their homeland when the Persians gained control of Babylon. Most of them stayed in Babylon. So they were not directly connected to the temple anymore. Even after the temple was rebuilt, most Jews did not live close enough to frequent the temple. Many of them may have been there only once in their life or sporadically because they were so far away. Well, what are they going to do? Well, they would gather together with their fellow believers and they would study the Torah. They would study the prophets. They would sing the Psalms. They would pray their prayers. They would be together as a community. And this would happen in a gathering place, which is what synagogue means. It's a place to gather together. And that's presumably where synagogues came to be. Honestly, we don't know. Scholars are not sure. We don't have any definitive textual or historical records which document when synagogues actually came into existence. We do know, however, that by the first century, they're all over the place. Archaeological finds have confirmed this. Writers First century writers such as Philo and Josephus, they talk about synagogues. And of course, the New Testament is full of references to these synagogues. So by the New Testament, by the time of Jesus, they're all over the place. And by the way, if you've ever wondered just how much the kind of the Greco-Roman society and language influenced first century Jews, well, go no further than the name synagogue. This quintessential Jewish institution has a Greek name. Synagogue is not a Hebrew name. It's a Greek name. So this gathering place of the Jews is called after a Greek name. It shows you just how much the Greek language and culture had influenced the people of God up to the first century. We have evidence, by the way, of what exactly the synagogues were for in this Theodotus inscription, which I have on the screen. This was found in 1913, and it describes what a first century synagogue was for. It was for reciting the law and studying the commandments. So you would read the law, you would study the scriptures, and it also adds that it was there as a kind of hostel or hotel for guests who were traveling to Jerusalem. So that's a little bit about the synagogues. Now, the people are amazed at Jesus because he spoke as one who had exousia, authority. If you do a concordant study, this word is found all over the New Testament. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus displays his authority, his exousia, primarily in three different ways. One, by casting out demons. One, by teaching. And then the last one, by forgiving sins. So it's fascinating to me that Jesus, with his authority, with this power that he has, how does he use it? Well, not for himself. He uses it for others. He gives the wisdom of God in teaching. He lifts the burden of transgressions from sinners by forgiving them. And he frees those who are held captive by evil spirits by exorcising, by casting out that evil spirit. That's how Jesus uses his power. Well, let's look at what happens when Jesus confronts this unclean spirit in Mark 1. Immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. Now, Mark has 4 accounts of exorcisms, 4 descriptions of Jesus' confrontation with people who are possessed by evil spirits. In 2 of them, here and then in Mark chapter 5, there's a back and forth, a dialogue between Jesus and the demon. Here we've read what the demon says. If we jump forward to chapter 5, in this particular case, this demon is called Legion. So there's a whole bunch of demons inside this person. And it says, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Now, this demon calls Jesus the Son of the Most High God. The demon in Mark chapter 1 calls him the Holy One of God. So it's ironic that in the Gospels, the demons know. They know exactly who this is. People might be a little bit unsure. They might think he's the Messiah. They might be pretty convinced he's the Messiah. They might reject him for being the Messiah. But the demons, they know. They know he's the Holy One of God. They know he's the Son of the Most High God. They know where he's from, Jesus of Nazareth. So if anybody knows in the Gospels who Jesus is, it's the demons, because they have identified him as the enemy. Now, I don't know where you get your idea of what demon possession is like. And maybe it's from movies like The Exorcist, maybe it's from novels, whatever it might be. I like to think of these unclean spirits possessing people within kind of a broader range of the world's disorder, what we might call the forces or the elements of creation's disorder. Things like unclean spirits, sin and evil, of course, the afflictions that bedevil us, whether it's illnesses, whether it's things like blindness and people being mute, people being lame, people suffering from COVID-19 or cancer or whatever it might be, as well as the forces of nature themselves, things like storms and volcanoes and floods and hurricanes and droughts. All of these are forces and elements of creation's disorder. In other words, all of these are indicative of a world that once was tov ma'od, very good, but now has kind of fallen back into chaos. And this chaos is manifested in any number of ways. It's always indicative of a world that's not the way that God wants it to be. And so all of these evil forces, all of these forces, the just destructive forces of nature, all of the illnesses that afflict us, every single one of these is pointing to the fact that creation, which was once very good, has fallen apart, is in need of redemption and recreation, which is, of course, exactly what the work of Christ is. He doesn't come simply to forgive sins. That's a huge part of what he does. But we can see from the Gospels that he doesn't just forgive sins. He heals people. He resurrects the dead. He calms storms. He's doing all sorts of recreative, restorative work in his world that has fallen into the state of chaos. And part of that ministry of his is in casting out evil spirits. Because, of course, there's not supposed to be evil spirits to begin with. They were the rebellious angels. But now, they certainly were not supposed to be inhabiting the bodies of God's children created in his image. So part of the ministry of Jesus is casting them out of the humans and driving them away so that these people might be freed from this bondage. Well, how does Jesus do it? Well, this is some fascinating stuff. So the word for rebuke, Jesus rebukes the evil spirit and says, be silent and come out of him. That Greek word for rebuke is epitomao. Now, if you look in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint translates epitomao with the Hebrew verb ga'ar. And most of these occurrences are these exact same words, whether you're looking at the original Hebrew or the translation. So if you scan the Old Testament for epitomao or for ga'ar, you can see that it becomes a technical word for God's rebuke of the world's forces of evil and chaos and ruin. Let me give you some examples. Nahum chapter 1, verse 4, and Psalm 106, verse 9 talks about how God rebukes the sea or rebukes the Red Sea and it dries up. So, in other words, when God was bringing his people out of their enslavement in Egypt and destroying their Egyptian foes, he rebuked the sea. He used his word to rebuke the sea so that it dried up and became a pathway to freedom for the Israelites and a pathway to death for their foes. By the way, jump ahead to Mark chapter 4, verse 39. That's the exact same word that's used when Jesus rebukes the wind in the storm on the Sea of Galilee. So this is Jesus doing exactly the same thing in the New Testament that Yahweh did in the Old Testament. Psalm 9, verse 6, Psalm 68, verse 31 has Yahweh rebuking the nations. That's epitomao in Greek, that's ga'ar in Hebrew. And then a fascinating passage, Zechariah chapter 3. The Lord said to Satan, to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan. So in Zechariah chapter 3, we have a direct reference to God rebuking, ga'ar and epitomao, rebuking Satan, which translates, of course, right over into the New Testament. Now, I want you to think for a minute about what's happening. When Jesus confronts this unclean spirit who's taken a human as his host, what he does is not utter some sort of magical incantation. There's no mumbo jumbo. There's no hocus pocus. There's no magical incantation that Jesus has to say in order to drive out this demon. We don't know what other exorcists of the first century did. We do know there were other exorcists who were doing that work in the first century. We read about these in the New Testament. We read about these in some papyri, in some extra biblical, some resources outside the scriptures. So we know there were exorcists in the first century, but we don't know exactly how they did what they did. We do know what Jesus did. We know exactly what he did. And he doesn't need any kind of magic. He doesn't need any kind of formula. He simply, by the power of who he is, and by the power of his word, rebukes, tells the unclean spirit to shut up and get out, and it does. Because Jesus, as we see from this Old Testament background of rebuking, of this rebuking of the Red Sea, rebuking of nations, rebuking of Satan, we see that Jesus is none other than Yahweh. He's Yahweh in the flesh. He's the Word become flesh, as John calls him. And he brings to bear all his divine person and authority in order to rebuke this evil in the synagogue in Capernaum, to rebuke the winds and the waves when his disciples are in the storm on the Sea of Galilee. He is the one who is rebuking that which is contrary to God's desire for an ordered world, in order that he might eventually bring forth this new order out of the chaos that the world has fallen into. Of course, that's going to happen in his resurrection, when he finally brings about this order that is going to ripple out to all creation when he raises us on the last day, so that we not only have restored bodies, but we now have a restored creation, a new heavens and a new earth where righteousness will dwell. That's the ultimate goal. That's the telos toward which God is bringing all creation, the recreation and the restoration of all things in Christ. So chaos will be no more, and in its place will be this perfect ordered world that God has created for us in the person of his Son. Now let's wrap this up. Last couple of verses, 27 and 28. How did everyone respond to this? Well, they were amazed, and they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. We don't know exactly how far that fame spread. Chances are it was pretty local at this point. Of course, over time, it's going to grow as more and more people hear about the work of Jesus. Most of Jesus' ministry early on was happening in the area around Galilee. But what he does and what he says, the impact of that is going to travel all over the land of Israel. And so his name will begin to spread. But for now, this is the beginning of his ministry. And this is the very first miracle recorded in the Gospel of Mark. He cast out an unclean spirit, thereby declaring that he is Yahweh who rebukes evil. Yahweh who rebukes the sea now rebukes this unclean spirit and frees this man from the power of that unclean spirit. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you, and I pray that everyone is doing well. I hope that the Lord's peace may be for you and for your family, and I pray that my words will be helpful to you as you meditate upon the gospel reading for this coming week. We will see you next week. Thank you.